The Second Anglo-Boer War, or more specifically, the Second War for Independence, would never have been fought if the biggest gold deposit that this world has ever known had not been discovered in the middle of the old Transvaal Republic here in South Africa. Along this ridge of land, whose center was to be named Johannesburg. And that is the fundamental, damnable truth across which this story of suffering and heroism grew.
As the century drew to a close, the age of English imperialism was at its height. The Queen Empress had long since celebrated her Diamond Jubilee and had bowed out of public life. In the village of St. Eve, in the county of Cornwall, was a woman named Emily Hobhouse. Emily's father was Archdeacon of Bodmin, and here Emily and her family lived far removed from the hardship and poverty of the mining community of Cornwall. In this little church opposite the rectory, the Archdeacon attempted to communicate with his parishioners. The Hobhouse family was wealthy and well-connected, and Emily watched with growing concern the conflict developing between Imperial Britain and the Transvaal Republic with its newly found wealth of gold.
Tragically, here in England, the great liberal spirit of William Ewart Gladstone was fast fading. And the new materialistic imperialists, represented by Britain's colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, was in the ascendancy. Yes, the British were pushing for control of the Transvaal Republic, and thereby the gold fields.
Finally, the patriarchal president of the Transvaal Republic, Paul Kruger, squared up to the entire British Empire. And there, in the Volksraad, the Boer Parliament, he made his statement.
The republics are determined, if they must belong to England, that a price will have to be paid which will stagger humanity.
Joseph Chamberlain, popularly known as Pushful Joe, was apparently not alarmed. He even eagerly accepted his imperial responsibility in the looming war. He said, "It is a feather in my cap." On October the 11th, 1899, the two Boer republics, knowing that there was no hope for peace, invaded the British colonies of the Cape and Natal, and by December, the Boers, the fighting farmers, were inflicting severe defeats upon the British imperial troops from one end of southern Africa to the other. But this military pattern could not last. The Boers were numerically a small nation. They could never muster more than 45,000 men, and against them were arriving massive British reinforcements from Britain, India, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. From February 1900 onwards, the Boers were pushed northward by this overwhelming weight, and so from that time, the Boers under Commandant General Louis Botha began to fight their famous guerrilla war. The Boers ceased to fight in the conventional manner and roamed their countries in mounted groups under such leaders as Generals De la Rey, Christian de Wet, Jan Smuts, and of course, Louis Botha.
And at this game, men fighting on their own land and for their own land, the British could not defeat them, at least by force of arms. And this reality began to enter the mind of Lord Roberts. He issued a proclamation to the Boer people, which carried a first hint of sinister and inevitable implications.
I warn all burghers to desist from any further hostility towards Her Majesty's government. And those burghers who continue to furnish the enemy with supplies or information will be dealt with according to the usages of war.
Considering those words, we must remember that they were addressed to the families of the men who were out fighting in their own country and for their own country.
The British Imperial troops were about to perpetrate against the two Boer republics a scorched earth policy, which was to be near total in its destruction. Indeed, as early as January 1900, the Reuters news agency had telegraphed back to Europe. The British force came upon 3 Boer farmsteads, and these they destroyed with dynamite and fire. This was a murmuring overture which was to build to a dulling crescendo over the following 2 years.
President Creer addressed his objection to Lord Roberts. We learn from many sides that British troops, contrary to the recognized usages of war, are guilty of the destruction with fire and blowing up with dynamite of farmhouses, of the devastation of farms and goods therein, whereby unprotected women and children are often deprived of food and cover.
Lord Roberts replied to this warning from the battlefield of Paardeberg. February the 24th, 1900. I am fully convinced that no willful destruction of property by Her Majesty's forces has taken place, except such as was absolutely necessary for military purposes.
There was the rub. What exactly was to become absolutely necessary for military purposes? The answer to that question was to become a nightmare. The British military machine wished to keep the destruction of farms and villages a secret. But this was an impossible conspiracy.
Shocked British soldiers began to write home, and some international newspaper war correspondents managed to avoid the British censor. A typical account was printed in Britain in the Morning Leader. The Guards Brigade are marching in, burning practically everything on the road. I hear today that General Rundle has burnt his way up to the village of De Wetstorp. The London Daily Chronicle printed on May the 28th, 1900, from end to end, the Orange River Colony, as the British call the Orange Free State, now lies ruined and starving. Oh yes, that British campaign far away down in southern Africa was growing extremely ugly.
When Miss Hobhouse first learnt what the British Army was perpetrating in southern Africa, she was 39 years old.
Emily Hobhouse decisively put aside the political questions between her country, Britain, and the Boer republics. Not that she didn't know or judge, but wisely and instinctively she focused on one awful question. What is happening to the women and children now that their two countries are being devastated and burnt? And so Emily left her genteel, privileged environment and stomped from one end of Great Britain to the other, speaking her mind very loudly and very clearly.
Of course, she was not alone. There were other high-principled Britishers, but for anyone who said one word on behalf of the Boer people, albeit Boer women and children, Britain had become a vindictive jungle.
Emily eventually was advertised to speak at a meeting here in her home county of Cornwall.
The Cornish Times reported the historic occasion.
Mr. Quiller Couch, the well-known novelist, presided.
The speakers will be Miss Emily Hobhouse and Mr. David Lloyd George.
Mr. David Lloyd George, the radical member of Parliament for Carnarvon.
We don't want you here, mate. Let's go on.
Mr. Lloyd George was unable even to utter a word. And after a scene of uproar and confusion unparalleled in Liscard, the platform was stormed by a party of young fellas, many of whom bore miniature Union Jacks, and the meeting was broken up in confusion. At this point, somebody started singing "Soldiers of the Queen." Oh, we're soldiers of the Queen, me lads, the Queen, me lads. Come on now, all together, lads. Oh, we're soldiers of the Queen, me lads, the Queen, me lads, the Queen, me lads. Oh, we're soldiers of the Queen, me lads. And the song was continued to the accompaniment of stamping feet, whistles, catcalls, and other noises. Come on now, lads, all together. Cheers were then given for some of the British generals in South Africa.
Cheers for Buller and Lord Roberts and three cheers for Bobs.
With hoots for Kruger.
And the Boers!
And further cheers.
Three cheers for Lord Roberts! And Buller! And Kitchener beat the bloody lot!
Down with Kruger!
Hey! Come on, lads! Charge!
Sheer fatigue alone put a stop to the singing for a time. Taking advantage of the lull, the chairman continued.
Let me assure you that we are all good patriots here.
But was interrupted by someone shouting,
Give somebody else a chance, sir. And I suggest Miss Hobhouse. After all, she is local. Lloyd George is damn radical.
Now,
please give Miss Emily Hobhouse a hearing.
We don't want to hurt. Let's hear what you got to say, Miss Hobhouse. No, let's have a hearing. No, Tom.
She, having been standing a mute spectator of the scene for some minutes, the disorder having decreased somewhat, Miss Hobhouse said,
I think you'll agree with me that if Her Gracious Majesty the Queen, to whom you have just sung, were present here now, she would be heartily ashamed of her Cornish subjects.
Bloody rubbish! We're bloody ashamed of you! Send her back to Cruiser Land!
I have a great deal that I'm anxious to say to you.
And I've got a good deal to say to you, too. We don't want any of her trouble here. We're so... Go on.
Will you not
you
sit
speaking?
down
No,
for a few minutes?
Bloody woman!
It seems to me a strange thing that Cornish men will not listen to a Cornish woman. This kind of behavior will do more to advance our humane cause than the most eloquent speeches we could deliver.
chairs were thrown all over the place, and several blows were struck. At that point, the police made their appearance on the platform, and the conflict at once ceased. Miss Hobhouse, with Mr. Curracooch and Mr. David Lloyd George, were then persuaded to leave the hall.
Emily Hobhouse had failed with words to convince her British compatriots that they should concern themselves with the innocent sufferings of women and children in South Africa. And now, her unstoppable mind began to veer towards more direct action. First, she founded a charity called the South African Women and Children's Distress Fund. And then she bought a second-class passage to Cape Town, South Africa, out of her own not wealthy pocket, sailing on December the 7th, 1900. Now she would see for herself what was happening to the women and the children. And she collected £300 to spend on them, where most it might be needed. No, it would not prove enough.
During the voyage, Emily Hobhouse studied South African history, and she studied the Dutch language, which the Boer people spoke.
When Emily arrived here in Cape Town, the war was fast deteriorating into one of desperate attrition. And it was here that she heard, for the first time, that the British were forming many camps up northward to hold the Boer women and children whose farms and villages had been burnt. And here in Cape Town, she saw messages reporting the awful events.
It is rumored here in this vicinity of Bloemfontein that strong punitive measures have been taken at Bothaville, a Boer village, and that the Dutch church is the only building left standing there.
Reuters News Agency, Kroonstad, October 26, 1900.
The British military column arrived at noon, destroying farms on its way. Not a single Boer home in the country between Dundee in Natal and Vryheid in the Transvaal has been left standing. All have been burned by the British troops.
Bloemfontein, November 5th, 1900.
It is stated that the village of Ventersburg has met with a fate similar to that of Bothaville, having been destroyed on account of its having been used as a Boer depot.
And then Emily began to learn of awful facts from British soldiers. A Lieutenant Morrison stated,
The British Provost Marshal came up from the main body of troops, removed the Boer women and children with their bedding, and then proceeded to burn or blow up the houses. From that time on, Our progress was like the old-time forages in the highlands of Scotland 2 centuries ago. We moved on from valley to valley, burning, looting, and turning out women and children to sit beside the ruins of their once beautiful farmsteads. It was a terrible thing to see. And I don't know that I want to see another trip of the sort. We burned a track about 6 miles wide through these fertile valleys and completely destroyed the village of Villeport and the town of Dulston.
And a Captain March Phillips of the British Army stated,
Oh, farm burning goes merrily on, and our course through the country is marked as in prehistoric ages, by pillars of smoke by day and fire by night. We usually burn from 6 to a dozen farms a day. I do not gather that any special reason is, or cause is alleged or proved against the farms burnt. If the Boers have used the farms, or the owner is on commando, or if the railway line within a certain distance has been blown up, or even if there are Boers in the neighborhood who persist in fighting. These are some of the reasons. The men belonging to the farms are always away fighting with the Boer army, and only women are left. Of these women, there are often 3 or even 4 generations, grandmother, mother, and family of girls. The boys over 13 years are usually away fighting with their papas. The girls and children huddle around in their cotton frocks, while our men set fire to the farms. Sometimes the women entreat that their homes may be spared, and once or twice, in an agony of rage, they invoke curses on our heads. But that is quite the exception. As a rule, they make no sign.
oh yes, Emily's worst fears were very fulfilled. £300 she now knew would not be enough. Not even £3 million would be enough. And so, carrying letters of introduction, she lunched with High Commissioner Sir Alfred Milner himself, here at Government House in Cape Town. He was also an uneasy bachelor.
Thank you. Well, Miss Hobhouse, let us discuss the predicament of the Boer women and children.
Sir Alfred, I would prefer to discuss that complicated subject when we are alone.
Oh. Well, perhaps I can manage 15 minutes afterwards in the withdrawing room.
Now, Sir Alfred, what are we going to do about the farm burning and the inevitable suffering?
Sir Alfred, one of the matters that worries me, as a patriotic British woman, is that we are fast turning the Boer women into martyrs. And we are creating such a deep resentment against us British that it'll take years to eradicate.
Yes.
Sir Alfred, you must be deeply aware of the distressing reports that Reuters and the Central News Agency and others are dispatching.
Yes,
To England,
indeed.
printed in the Times,
Yes,
in full.
indeed.
And I understand that virtually all the nations of Europe are reveling in what they refer to as our British disgrace.
Yes. Farm burning is a questionable method.
I think, Sir Alfred, that it would demonstrate to the world at large that we do care about the suffering of innocent parties if you, Sir Alfred, were to arrange for me to visit the refugee camps, which I believe are being set up.
Oh, yes. Yes, dear lady, you are right. I will communicate immediately with Lord Kitchener. The military must approve. Yes. But I am sure that his lordship will see the wisdom of your venture. And the humanity.
Thank you, Sir Alfred. Thank you.
The interview had lasted not 15 minutes, but 1 hour.
However, Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, who was now the Commander-in-Chief, was not such a pushover as Sir Alfred Milner. Kitchener barked.
Miss Emily Hobhouse may visit as far north as Bloemfontein, but no further. And I hope that this will be clearly understood.
Further north than Bloemfontein, the countries were beginning to look like hell. The military authorities here in Cape Town placed a 12-ton railway wagon at Emily's disposal, and she, having blown her £300 on food supplies, clothes and bedding, set off northwards into Africa, taking also for her personal comfort a kettle lamp, some bread, some butter, some apricot jam, tea and cocoa.
The train carrying Emily trundled over the great, apparently empty highland called the Karoo. It stopped frequently, and everywhere were British Tommies. Emily must have looked an odd sight at the occasional wayside station, the determined English spinster.
She began to see the occasional isolated burnt-out farmhouse, the carcasses of dead cattle and horses. British Tommies begged for newspapers. She gave them what she had and all of her novels.